A lot of airsoft players are really worried about some new regulations that could change our hobby in the United States. So in today's video, let's talk about these new regulations, what they mean for you as a player, and my own personal opinion on them. What's up, Airsofters? My name is Lane, and over the last couple of days, there's been a lot of discussions about some new regulations that people think will destroy Airsoft. It will completely change the hobby forever or ban Airsoft. And because of that, there's been a lot of misconceptions about this, and a lot of retailers have gotten on board and talked about this and immediately said, hey, you need to oppose this. But in today's video, I really just want to take a step back, take a look at what are in these new regulations, and see ultimately how it will affect us as players. Now, first and foremost, we need to talk about what the regulations are, and then we'll get into some of the details of it. Now, I want to look down at my notes just to make sure I get this absolutely right. This is docket CPSC-2023-0021, and this comes from the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So all this information will be down in the description below, so you can look at it yourself and make up your own mind. But essentially what these regulations would do is keep some rules that we already have in place for Airsoft in the United States, but introduce some other ones. And the ones that they would be introducing would essentially put new safety rules in place for Airsoft that would have to be developed. And this is where a lot of people are concerned. They may be just a little bit misinformed. They may have some genuine concerns as well. But these safety concerns are the same ones that we see in everyday life. The Consumer Protection Safety Commission establishes the rules for safety of everyday products. They're also the US agency that establishes recalls. So when you see a recall for, like a baby stroller or, computer hardware, whatever it may be, when there's a voluntary recall, this is the government agency that plays a role in those decisions, that works with companies to make sure that the products that they're selling are safe for the everyday consumer. So essentially, they want to put these regulations on Airsoft, because if you've ever looked into the laws of Airsoft, we don't have the same protection that a lot of very similar industries have. Those similar industries being, air guns, like actual pellet BB guns that shoot the 4.5 millimeter, actual metal BBs, paintball guns, things like that. And this can be really concerning for industries like Airsoft, like gel blasters, these kind of emerging industries where there aren't exactly any rules on paper about them or any regulations defining what is legal and what is illegal with these. Now, there are other laws on the books for Airsoft, both at the federal and the state level, depending on where you live. For instance, I live in New York State, where there's a lot of rules about Airsoft at the state level, but really there hasn't been anything comprehensive in terms of safety. Now, the big thing that people are concerned about is that these safety precautions would require the creation of certain standards for testing and quality control to make sure that when people get these products, that they're going to be safe with it, that they're not going to hurt themselves, and they're not going to hurt others. Now, if you've ever played Airsoft, you know that as players, as an industry, we've established certain safety precautions, not necessarily with the airsoft guns themselves, but really at the usage level. Like, we make sure that when you go to a field, you have to be under a certain velocity with your FPS, that you have to have additional safety gear like eye protection, like face protection, ear protection, even at some fields. But this would essentially create those restrictions at the federal level. The manufacturers would have to comply with them. And I think this is why you're seeing a lot of retailers jump on board and immediately have a hesitation towards wanting this to go through. But because this is through the CPSC, this is something that a lot of industries have. I would almost argue every single industry has this sort of thing. So it's not a surprise that they want to eventually regulate this. Now, some of the other things that would be in there is things that we already have, like mandating that there's an orange tip. That's just a US thing. I know that's not around in other countries. I don't think that's a battle we're going to win. I think those are going to be sticking around in Airsoft forever. But really, I guess the question that a lot of players still have in their head is this bad? And ultimately, I think that, yeah, this could be a bad thing if it's done incorrectly. That's the sticking point for me. Because I think that as Airsofters, as an industry, we have grown significantly over the years. If I look at Airsoft now versus what it was when I first started playing 15 years ago, things are completely different. Airsoft is a much more legitimate and well-known hobby. Like in 2009, If I told somebody that I played airsoft almost around the time that I started, they wouldn't know what it is. But now if you tell somebody, they probably have a good idea of what airsoft is, or they figure it out. They're like, oh, they're like this, they're like gel blasters, or they're like Nerf, like they can relate it to something else. This is a much larger and a much more legitimate hobby, and it comes as no surprise to me that there are some attempts to regulate it, but not all regulation is bad in my opinion. One of the largest things that I personally oppose with this new regulation is the time frame. It's going along fairly fast. Now you have until June 12th to submit your comments for this particular regulation. And again, all of that will be linked down in the description below. And most retailers out there want you to just say a blanket, no, we don't like this, we don't want to see it. The issue that a lot of them have is that if this regulation goes into place, these new rules, these new standards that all manufacturers would have to abide by to make their products and then import them to the United States, that to be by June 26th of this same year. So that's, 20 days away from when I'm making this video. That's not a lot of time to establish regulations, to establish quality control procedures, and then also make sure that the factories in China, Taiwan, Denmark, even here in the US, are following those particular standards. So that's one of the biggest pieces that people are in opposition of, but I think that if we do this in a smart way, it's really not a huge concern that we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, from the industry side, one of the biggest complaints that I've seen has been, well, what about all the stuff that's already on transit? If you're transporting airsoft guns from China or Taiwan to the United States, you've probably got a pretty sizable amount that are on a boat or sitting in customs right now. And that's one of the biggest arguments that you see against this is, oh, it would be bad for airsoft manufacturers because it could just shut down airsoft gun sales overnight, which is a possibility, and that'd be very bad, don't get me wrong. But I think the way that we need to look at this is we need to regulate airsoft and in turn legitimize it on our own terms as an industry. I think one of the biggest industries that you've seen fight any sort of regulation over the last 10 years or so has been social media. If you look at the way that they handle things, they prefer to self-regulate because government regulation is going to be bad. It's not going to be what they want. It's going to hinder the experience for their users and their customers. So they've self-regulated. I think that we're at a point as an industry where self-regulation just won't go any farther. I think that regulation through the government is inevitable because, there are concerns about firearms, about imitation firearms like airsoft, and their safety. There have unfortunately been a number of tragedies over the years where people have ended up being shot by police with real firearms because they were holding an imitation toy. And a lot of the conditions about this and wanting to kind of legitimize airsoft and put some regulations in it, in my opinion, is to get us up to those standards of paintball, of actual BB guns, because they have a lot of rules and regulations that are self-regulated, I will add. We'll talk about that in a second, talking about brandishing these things out in public, because it's all about safety. I think a lot of people who are in airsoft understand the safety of, putting on your goggles and actual field etiquette and safety, but then we kind of fall short of making sure they're protected in gun cases, making sure you're not bringing these things out in public because that can pose a gigantic risk to you. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions that I see is the idea that airsoft guns would have to be regulated by a third party. And this is the case in some industries, but in my opinion, and looking at all this information and looking at the CPSC's website, that isn't the case. If you're making adult items, which airsoft would fall under, they're definitely not a child's item, you can self-regulate. And you can have these standards that you'd have to meet for safety and quality control, which do have to be approved by the government, but you can approve those yourself. Even the factories in China, Taiwan, wherever in the world, as long as we establish these standards, as long as they follow them overseas, and then they can prove that they followed them on their shipping docket when they bring them into America, that's fine. And, that may add a little bit extra cost, a little bit extra time, but hear me out, airsoft companies should be doing quality control anyways. I think that's one of the biggest issues that we have as an industry is sometimes you just order an airsoft gun and it comes broken in the box. If we can establish quality control to make sure that they work and make sure that they're safe for players, that they're the velocity that they advertise themselves at, I don't see that as a problem personally. I think that would be a great step forward for airsoft. And at the same time, if we can get laws on the book that clearly define what an airsoft gun is. Because if you look at the definition from law to law, sometimes it can be unclear, contradictory. It can be contradictory at the state level as well. I don't see that being a bad thing. I understand that some people are no, absolutely not. They hold the position of any regulation is bad. But I think when you see the writing on the wall and realize that it's going to come eventually, I think it's better to make these regulations on our own terms and have, manufacturers, trade groups within the industry working with the government to establish standards that are realistic. I think that's the best case scenario. You want these restrictions and you want any sort of regulations to be created by people who know what they're talking about. If we allow them to write these rules without the input of actual airsofters, of people in the industry that know the product, the laws are going to make no sense. I'm sure whatever hobby you've been in, you've heard of a law before that just makes zero sense. But if we work with these people, if we work with the CPSC who want this sort of feedback, who want trade partners to work with them, to establish them, I think it's going to be the best case scenario overall. Voluntary regulation is going to be the best regulation overall, in my opinion. And I think that just because we can't escape it, we might as well make the best of it, in all honesty. And I think that it would not only legitimize our hobby, but make things better going forward, in my opinion. So at the end of the day, what should you do as a player? Well, if you want to send a letter to the CPCS, there is a way to comment. Again, all this is down below, and say that you oppose it. I don't think that's a bad idea. I would recommend it because I think one of the biggest issues is that time frame. It's just unrealistic for the comment period to end on June 12th, 2023, and have all the regulations and all the proceedings happen in, 2 weeks from then at June 26th. This is just way too big of a hobby. It's too complex, and I don't think that we're going to get a set of regulations that are realistic, applicable, or beneficial to airsoft in that time frame. But I think in the grand scheme of things, this isn't a bad conversation to have. And if we can get these sort of regulations and do it in a time frame that makes sense, that allows people to put their input in for industry partners to, again, work with the CPSC, I think that that would be the best overall. I just think that a lot of people have a concern with the time frame of this. And I think that's going to really, I think that if we were able to extend that time and work on something, really let it bake, get something that's more legitimate, that would be the best way to go. But those are just my thoughts on this. Again, I will have the laws that I referenced, the actual regulations that we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes. That'll all be linked down below so that you can leave your comment. Just make sure that if you are leaving a comment, please be professional. That is one of the biggest things that you can do to get your point across. If you want to convince somebody that what they're doing isn't the best way, being rude to them is not going to be the appropriate way to handle the situation at all. Those are just my thoughts. I originally wasn't even going to make this video, but I see a lot of people out there kind of fear-mongering, and I've seen some retailers even go as far to say that this would kill airsoft entirely, and I just don't believe that that is the case. So thank you all so much for watching. Because this is a video that affects us all as airsofters, I don't want to use it to promote myself, but I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody who supports the channel and our channel members as well, for making all of my videos possible. But my name is Lane, and I will see you in the next video for hopefully a much more cheery video.